Welcome, everybody. We're having Maestra Rosa Marcella, she and her, talking to us today about trans history, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Maestra.
Hello, and I got rid of my name and everything too. I'm so glad this isn't that formal. Anyways, hi, I am MAESTRI Rosa Marcella. My honorific is actually gender neutral for reasons of I am she, they, gender queer presenting, mostly femme. Um, I will start here. I started this class, history, teaching, and research because I was curious. I'll get to that later. I'm out of order. This is why I have slides. Okay, let's start here. Maestri Rosa Marcella, that is me. I've been in the SCA since I was 5 years old. Second generation, I've lived and participated in four kingdoms, including Collintier, Drachenwald, the Middle, and now I live in Antir, and I will try my hardest never to leave Antir because it is beautiful out here. I am a Maestra of Defense, and both my parents are peers, and my sister still participates. So we're still a decent sized family. I've been multiple kingdom and baronial offices throughout my life, but I really have a passion about teaching. My biggest reason for this research is I am actually professionally trained in DEI in the workplace. Um, I came out as a trans woman when I found out about gender dysphoria back in 2020. And then I've been also working on my authentic self with all this history and research. So I've been collecting and reading several queer history books, such as same-sex couplings, transgender warrior right now, and then I've got the next up is female husbands and other articles and stuff I've been reading. I wanted to know why I didn't hear about these people when I was a kid, when the first times that I thought about my gender dysphoria and um, thought I was supposed to be born a girl and not actually presenting as a man. Some basic definitions, since these are still kind of new out there for people to describe, and will be brought up because that's the best way I can keep things as gender neutral as possible. And also talking about things of how some of these peer-reviewed articles and um, books that I've been reading have described finding transgender people in the medieval ages and ancient times and beyond. Most of my research right now is Eurocentric because that's what the books I've been buying, um, since my persona is all over the place right now, since I went from a British English persona. Now I'm like Italian Finnish because I just want to have fun. But as per to the DSM-5, gender dysphoria is just you identify as something different than you were born with by gender. So it could be anything as long as it's not what you were assigned at birth. So now we have several types of genders, but they didn't have these definitions. So even one article that I read stated, without knowing medical terms from these days, how did we find transgender people? Um, so yeah, so it was also interesting reading how they did gender confirmation surgeries during that time. Not very pleasant. Surprised that they had it, but still not pleasant. So this is all how what gender dysphoria is and how it's listed out by its DSM-5 definition. Um, and these are all the things that are included, but the basic one most of these PhD historians use was this basic first paragraph here of you identify as something different than what you were born as. Some other definitions that are pretty common in the transgender warrior world, the book was Transgender Warrior, sorry. AMAB, assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth for AFAB, male to female, female to male, depending on how you transition. Then we also have trans male, female, non-binary, which are more modern labels than back in anything pre at least 1800s. I still haven't found anything in the 1800s yet for expressions except for female husbands, which that's where they kind of found trans people and lesbians at the same time. They couldn't really identify who was presenting male because they had to in the world, or if they were just lesbians and they presented male because of the economy so that they can live with their wife. So they had very that was part of the things I was reading too. A lot of other gender identities were usually called out as eunuchs in the time for female or male, yeah, female to male presenting um, trans people. Does anyone have any questions up to this point before I get into? I start with Roman era. I just figured I'll check the chat room. I don't.
I did want to mention that in the reaction
Okay, nice.
button at the bottom of your screen is an opportunity to raise hands. Who could use that method for letting us know that you have a question.
Yep, I'm totally open with questions, and I'll kind of break out like when I get to sections, just kind of because I talk fast. I really do, and I try to I try to get enough content for an hour, but my speech sometimes doesn't help. Anyways, so a lot of the things that we talk about today for gender dysphoria and gender identity was obviously not definitions we had back then. Gender nonconforming people have actually been around longer than civilization has. As we know, we used to get taught in high school that there were hunter gatherers and that the males went out to hunt and the females stayed together and learned how to make crops and everything. Well, most recent research in the past few decades has shown that's wrong in a lot of ways, especially with some new burial sites that I'll bring up later, that tending to even to American Two Spirits and other sorts of paganism. If you thought differently in any way than the norm, they actually found you kind of as a healer or a shaman or a priest, that you were divine because you had this ability to think outside the box. And a lot of holy people on certain priests and healers and everything were trans in some way or gender nonconforming, or even in some of my research mental health wise, ADHD and all this stuff, because they helped keep the tribe going, the traditions, they knew all the things because they could memorize it, and they played to their strengths way more than they actually just played by gender roles because they had to survive. So this was about survival more than actual gender, anything gendered. Gendering didn't actually come around until Greek and Roman era, which I have some names here that I will get into. But from same-sex couplings, as I drop all my stuff, books, oops, and same-sex couplings, a lot of gendered stuff came around because of civilization. Um, we got gendered because the rich, oh, and there is a difference between cis and trans, which I will go add to my definition later. Trans is you're born a different gender, or you identify as a different gender, where cis, you identify as the gender you are born with. So cis Roman males at the time, especially ones that had lots of land, really wanted ways to keep their land. So a lot of laws were created on the spot on how rich people could keep their lands. The Romans were the ones that mostly try to get rid of a lot of these trans priests and everything that I read about, that I learned about, because they were trying to control the religions and the people more than the actual gender. But here's some like ideas of like Dionysus, which that spelling looks weird. I don't know where I got that spelling. Is a huge used to be like a party god, wine god that we were told, but actually, in some more of my research, he wore different clothing and celebrated people and celebrated love and affections and wore he wore male and female type clothing, which again, until this time, things weren't gendered clothing didn't come around until like 400 BC to five no, or sooner than that, around 1000 to 2000 BC. Sorry, I was way off. But then you got hermaphroditus, which intersex people were a thing throughout the ages, and so were trans people. Um, I read about Begoaz, which um, was one of Alexander the Great's lover, which that is something I did learn in college, but not necessarily in high school, about how queer the Greeks and pre-Roman people were, with their students and everything. And Begoaz was actually supposedly a eunuch, um, or made into a eunuch, as they called it, to because they presented as female for um, Alexander's lover, even though Alexander did have Aristotle as his main lover and teacher also, but he was an emperor. He had what he wanted. And then there's this is why these names are so much fun. Elagabalus. I should have practiced names and stuff. Was an actual prostitute at the time, and a seamstress. Was this one? No, that was. I'm confusing people. Anyways, she actually asked for gender confirmation surgery, and I didn't want to write it all out, but I kind of kept the paper of pretty much they were going to use a stone to. Well, that's Hilarion. That's not who I want. They were going to use a stone to make them a eunuch, and then try to, because their dysphoria was so bad, that's how they were going to do the gender confirming surgery at this time. It was very hard to read, especially when I read the other ways that eunuchs were made during that time, and why usually when I get into the next part, during Christianity, I remember in high school and college that to get an education, a lot of people became monks, priests, and stuff, especially in the early times. Well, in the 5th century and on to like the 1100s and stuff, 12th century, there is plenty of evidence of AFABs passing as eunuchs for monks, which I actually never got the date when this article was written, by Bentecourt. It was about art of trans people and people in medieval times and stuff. Another monk was John or Mary or Marionos. Sorry, John was somebody else. Was a transgender monk, which they came out because there was a bunch of conflict. And I thought their story was actually really interesting. It was brought up in both my article, where they're transgender people in the Middle Ages and then transgender lives in the Middle Ages through art, literature, and medicine. And Marianos actually followed their father, and that's why they transitioned. Yeah, so this is the fun little story that I wanted to talk about Mary, or Marianos, as they're passing. There was a young child named Mary who was raised by their father after their mother dies. Once the child has come of age, the father decides that he wishes to join the monastery. Wishing not to be separated from their father, the child asks to have their hair shorn, be clothed as a man, and their name changed to Marianos, so that they may continue to share life with their father. Here, as is always the case, the male clothed female body is understood as being that of a eunuch. Marianos lives their life in the monastery their beardless face and delicate voice interpreted by others as evidence of their status as a eunuch, because sometimes they wanted to keep kids' voices high for singing. Like many of these figures, Marinos is heralded for their great asceticism, eating only once every day, a practice that, as we shall see, might have been aimed at stopping menstruation and lessening the appearance of breasts. Eventually, Marinos' father passes away, and they are left to bear their secret alone. There are modern ways people have done this. I talked to a trans woman recently when she couldn't get the medical care of doing things to help them present. Why? Oh, my presentation is going without me. Sorry, let me restart the slide. I thought I paused it. So, don't automatically play. Anyways, so so that I found it interesting on how they had found ways to pretty much he starved themselves to get rid of any female presenting things. But what happened to poor Marinos is he was accused of defiling a nearby innkeeper's daughter who had copulated with a soldier. Upon conceiving a child, she blames the young monk, the attractive one called Marinos. Marinos accepts the charges, saying, "I have sinned as a man," and embraces the shame of the crime that they did not commit, and lives immediately, and pretty much that's how they leave the monastery. And I'm hearing beeping. Okay, someone's just clarifying over there. Cool. Because I can't really see over here. So yeah, so they left the monastery after their father passed away, because they had no other reason to be there, and that's just how they left. They're like, sure, I got someone pregnant. I don't know how, but instead of anyone else getting in trouble, that's what they took the fault. There's also Hilarion and Anastasius, a couple other eunuch monks that got brought up. There's supposedly Pope Joan. I'm still trying to find research. I thought I heard somewhere or read somewhere about a trans pope, but I still can't find exact evidence, so I didn't write down anything about Pope Joan. But that's just things I'm still trying to find, since I've only been doing this research for about a year and a half. Recently, there's been a huge article out about, and I was excited since my heritage is Finnish, about they named them Sonataka, that they were a Finnish intersex Norse, because they actually did a DNA test on them and had both double XY chromosomes. So they were by definition intersex medically. How they were buried, though, they thought were with traditionally women's clothing, but also had two swords. And we also have been learning a lot lately about how Norse were a lot less gendered than most of medieval history, but still had gendered things. They looked like they were knowable, and the burial site was about 1,000 years old from today. It's a great article. I have it back in my references if anyone wants a copy of where to find this article about how they just did that. There's a lot of these new burial sites that are coming out of, well, they just assumed it was female because they were buried with female items. And then come to find out later, no, they were actually male because they did a DNA test. So a lot of the misogynistic old research, where usually it tended to be males doing the archaeology and stuff, has become less male oriented. And this is part of the research of them going back and re-researching what was found in the 40s and the 1800s and the 1900s and stuff. So, which it's weird to say the 1900s coming from the 80s, but whatever. Um, so they're really looking back at all the old stuff. Like um, there was an article out there about some fertility gods that were actually notches for bows because of how they were shaped. They fit the sinew pretty well. So there's a lot of research from these archaeological finds, but this is the most recent big one that hit all over Facebook, and I had to still share it because I thought it was very relevant to what I'm talking about, because trans, intersex, we all can experience HRT, we all experience somewhat gender dysphoria, but not, well, we don't all, sorry. Let me take out the absolute. Most of us go through HRT, most of us go through gender dysphoria, but gender dysphoria is really just defined as, how do I represent myself? What do I view as myself? And you don't really need to be dysphoric to have it, which I didn't talk about that because I didn't feel like a lot of that mental stuff wasn't needed here, just more the simple definitions. There's another one out of Leslie Feinberg. He was a male transgender that grew up in the early 1960s. Very difficult. And you got to remember, even in modern times, we're more and more getting public. But even in modern times now, we still have to hide. We're still very much, and that will be on the next slide, of some actual data that some of these people have found based off of how many trans people were actually around in those times, just based off of statistics now and the amount of population. But there's a lot of argument if Joan of Arc was actually a trans man or just somebody wearing male clothing because they had to be this military leader. The big thing that they feared with Joan of Arc was when they gave him, I call him him now, just because of how Leslie argued the state that they were supposedly burned at the stake for wearing men's clothes and not witchcraft. Supposedly, I'm still trying to find the research. I've been told maybe not. I still haven't found the exact piece of article that I'm looking for. The primary source. That's the word I'm looking for. Biggest fear that a lot of people had was that Joan of Arc could lead a peasant army, and were afraid because they had the ears of the peasants that there would be a revolt, and had to publicly pretty much humiliate Joan of Arc to keep all the peasants down and make sure that they listened to authority. And that was the huge reason why they got burned at the stake, just enough to where the clothes showed to show that they were actually female underneath those clothes and not a man. Again, still trying to find the primary source, since this technically came from a tertiary and a secondary source from a actual professor. Also states maybe in their article and not an absolute like Leslie did, but Transgender Warrior was a great starting point where he talked a lot about connecting the dots and what I wanted to do. So it gave me a good starting point. But I always like bringing up Joan of Arc because even in my community, talking to some friends in Ontario, they're still not quite sure we can, but by the DSM-5, we could say Joan of Arc was trans, a trans man. Again, I made sure to grab from, I don't know why I said again. Anyways, trans history, what's been nice about it, what I stated over about the intersex Finnish Norse person. More and more, we are learning that the human species is not now and has never been limited to two types of gender, two types of cultures, two types of brains, or two types of bodies. I read that quote and I was like, this has been all my research. We are not a binary culture by any means. And same-sex couplings really proved that to me, that the reason we became binary is because rich people wanted to keep their lands, how marriages came around was really interesting because they talked about a rich gay man that wanted to marry a man, and that was it. He had absolutely no attraction to females. Then this suddenly is where ageism came in, because now they're like, well, who's the actual holder or owner of the land? Is it the older gentleman or the younger gentleman, because of how this marriage happened? And there was a big, lots of criers, as we call them, but that's what they were. News articles talking about how they were absolutely confused with a same-sex rich person. Like all the peasants and everyone below, anyone that was just soldiers and just trying to live as things, they didn't really usually care about until about the 1400s, where marriage, Sarge and Bacchus, which was closer to Roman era, that's who Bacchus was. I had a very brief moment, was around the Roman era, but just as Christianity was starting. They were actually a same-sex couple that were turned into Catholic saints, which I found totally interesting, with all the trans monks that they had before the 1400s, where they had all the queer laws were created because the rich people had whoever they wanted to bear children. Bastard children weren't even a thing until pretty much up to St. Thomas Aquinas, who he kind of like defined things because he really didn't like the no structure of things. So you get a lot of these things, all the way up to this quote that I just love, that's about how culture is not what we thought it was back then. And there was an on-tier collegium where we had a guest professor as the key speaker that told us how the Puritans and the Victorians, I think, the Victorians kind of ruined a lot of medieval history for us and romanticized it, and um oh, I need water. And we kind of lost sight of a lot of things. I found this is a fact I've been trying to find in all my research. Like, how many of us were there? A demographer of medieval Europe estimated there were about 19 million people living in France and the Low Countries, which are now are called Netherlands and Belgium, in 1340. If approximately 6.6% of those adults were trans and 1 in 2,000 of the adults are intersex, that gives us a figure of about 114 trans people and around 9,500 intersex people living in the 14th century. So I thought that was interesting. I just came back to check to see if there was any hands up. No, thank you. So I'll go back. This is actually the last slide, which I thought I had enough information, but I told you I talk fast. I try not to. So here's all the current references that I have from my research between queer and trans history. A lot of other fun things that I have learned about. Oh, there was, I thought I had it in the slide. I guess I just forgot to add it. There was John. There was one more person I wanted to talk about. Okay, let's see. Mary of Egypt. No, they were. Crap, I lost it. There was a person that was presenting as female. They were male to female. They were a sex worker and a seamstress. And they were pretty much, Eleanor Reichener. This is why I am not a herald. But I can get off of this. If anyone wants my references, I can totally share everything. I've actually got more books I'm super excited to start reading. Things you never thought about looking for queer history: witchcraft, sexuality, and religion. So I've got like Opedia, Epidus, and the Devil. I got transgender history that I'm still going to read. And currently I'm on Female Husbands, which is about trans people in the 1800s. So it's a little later period than I like, but that gave me the idea of how do you search for trans people a little bit better in history. Um, this, by far, as you can see, I marked the heck out of this book. This is written by Dr. John Boswell, um, who unfortunately has passed away a while ago, but he was a gay studies historian, um, excellent researcher. This whole entire book, as you can see, the marking stop here is because this is all his references on every page. So, and not including the appendix in the back of everything where he grabbed gay ceremonies. There's Catholic same-sex ceremonies. There's everything from adoption ceremonies in here, how the Jewish treated trans and queer people, because he brought them all together in this book. And it's an older book, but I got a lot of information out of here.
Rosa, if you're done
Yes.
sharing your presentation, can you go back to not sharing your screen?
Yes, I can do that. Woohoo. So I found Eleanor Ricknor kind of like the same person in Female Husband, who a lot of laws were created because of queer people. A lot of our straight laws that we have to this day were actually created because of queer people. And before we had juries in England in the 1800s, this is where that story starts in Female Husbands. But this article is describing gender dysphoria with Eleanor Reichner. The medieval court case of Eleanor Reichner shows a legal system that is trying to square a person who lives as a woman and calls herself Eleanor. With other information that leads the court to identify Eleanor as a man actually named John. And the testimony of this 14th century London trial, why is it always London? Anyways, because that's Female Husbands too. That was a London trial. I just thought that was hilarious. Eleanor is brought into the court of accusations of sexual misconduct and whether or not sodomy was committed. Oh no, sodomy, such a horrible thing to get a crime for. But that's actually in Female Husbands too, but she was actually under fraud for medical cases and stuff, more than just her wife got fed up living with a woman and went to the courts to get the divorce, and it was interesting. The court does not know, or rather cannot decide, because they cannot decide whether or not Eleanor is a man or a woman. She gives her name as Eleanor and presents as a woman to the courts, but after interrogation, she is forced to confess that yes, she once lived in London as a man named John. She tells the story of her transition and her new work as seamstress and sex worker. She discusses sleeping with both men and women, from aristocrats to nuns and priests, some who offered her pay at her presence. In the end, there was no verdict because they still could not state. In the end, a verdict is not recorded. Indeed, while the text records both names, Eleanor and John, it is written in Latin, which allowed for the proceedings to continue without the male or female pronouns frequently required by English or French. The court, it seems, did not want to decide on a pronoun because they were still trying to decide what gender to consider Eleanor. Thus, history is left with a record of a trans woman and then also a record of conflict, which is a textbook gender dysphoria, a marked difference between the individual's experienced gender and the genders others would assign to him or their, or her, I guess, or their works too, I guess, whatever. So this entire article I kind of skimmed over and read over, but yeah, a lot of these things today we would call non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, other things like that. kind of comes and evolves, that even in Transgender Warrior, Leslie realized that the definitions he had at that time writing the book might be antiquated by the time I read it. And that was the first chapter that he stated that this is my definitions now. I realize we're still evolving as a culture and as a community, that they might be different than what you read. So I apologize if anything offends you, because certain words were allowed at that time in the community that are not now. But that is from the research I have right now, and I'll definitely have to fluff it up a little bit, because like I said, I talk a lot, so I never know how much information I can get into an hour class. But I also talk really fast, so I never know how much information I can fit in an hour class. So I would open this up for discussion or questions right now, of anything you guys want to know that I just maybe forgot to mention that I didn't think was relevant.
Shoshona has hand up.
Just don't, yeah.
All right. My dog is barking in the background. I apologize. I think that it is crucial that we realize what you just referred to, Rosa, in reading Leslie Feinberg, that the vocabulary we use, more importantly, the framing notions that we employ are fluid and have changed. I've seen them change quite considerably in the last 30 years. I was strongly involved in what I call the trans wars of the 90s on email. The big issue there was such and such person transsexual or transgendered, and parsing that difference. That's sounds quaint by 30 years later. I think one needs to know, one should think of this as either a spectrum or better, a blob of being gender unusual. And
gender unusual, I like that one.
I
so I also liked in sociology that we're social deviants, because we're outside the social norm.
Has a normative value to it that's negative.
Yeah.
But asking specifically the question, was Jeanne d'Arc a trans man? Yeah, well, somewhere on the spectrum.
By the definition,
yeah.
By the definition, did they represent themselves differently than what they were born or assigned? That's the definition these researchers are going off of.
Yeah, the definitions change depending on it. There is not a single accepted definition, and what is accepted today by even a given researcher was not what was used by that same researcher 15 years ago. So we just have to be flexible and be mindful of that.
Very important, yes, and that's what I was trying to get at the beginning, and I just lost with some of the research. Like, a lot of this is the historians had to dig through and really define the queer people and find the trans people, because they had to, because if it wasn't recorded, how could you find it and stuff. And so unfortunately, a lot of these things are court cases or monks and stuff, because they did document things like this. Baroness Telenor, I saw your hand first.
Sure.
I think.
Thank you for bringing up Leslie Feinberg. When I first met him, he was going by they, and the thing I wanted to point out was I think Shoshona did hit on this, but it's even farther afield. That the terminology is changing, the definitions are changing. This is a very fluid thing, even in our times now. I feel myself very privileged and lucky to have had an opportunity to interview Sylvia Rivera twice, who was the person who threw the first stones at Stonewall. Okay, they were actually coins according to her, but the terminology that was used in the 60s, someone who represented themselves in somebody who had a feminine gender expression, who was born male, was a transvestite until they had surgery, and then they were a sex change. And to hear those words in today's context is just horribly offensive. And yet that was the common terminology 50 years ago. And then Shoshana, you brought up the distinction transsexual, transgender with the trans wars of the 90s. Absolutely. And so even that today feels odd, but it was such an advance over the 1960s. So here's evidence that things are constantly changing. And Rosa, thank you for being where we are today in terms of that terminology.
Okay.
Looking forward to where we go in the future.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine calling a trans man a eunuch, or even a sex changed female or something like that. Like that term alone, that's changed. Like, yes, there's still technically eunuchs, but that's a whole actual different definition, where that's where they were trying to find a lot of gender non-conforming people was, did we have sex change? Like, thank God we got away from horse urine for estrogen and stuff from back in the day, and reading like the actual, who was the first, like in the late 70s or 80s, Leslie talked about the first transgender confirming surgery.
There was one in the 1930s.
30s. Okay.
They made a movie in the last 5 years or so about The Danish Girl was the name of the movie, and I am so terrible with names. I can't remember her name.
Okay, that's who that was. But
Yeah.
anyways, when they talk,
famous one in the
when they
50s.
so, some graphic things. If anyone is uneasy, I could talk about these later of how they made eunuchs.
Lily Elba was the name.
Okay. There were some harsh ways they made eunuchs for young kids and stuff, and the worst one was hot baths and grinding stones down there. That was the worst one I read, to try to dissolve everything down there while you were growing up. So I am so glad for modern medicine now. Brigitte, I did see your hands up. Did you still have a question?
Yeah, some of it was just about how you went through describing the information with Joan of Arc, and I know a lot of it's like theory, with people going through and discussing ideas, and it's a little weird because a few times you kind of like seemed like you presented it as fact, coming from like how he or she or they were burned at the stake for this reason, or presented publicly in this reason. And I was wondering if you had primary sources to actually back that up, or if it was a lot of like, theory of people who study these things.
So the first was tertiary, and I had a hard time believing it with Leslie. Leslie went on their trans journey through communist communities in the United States to get educated. So supposedly they had these special resources, as they talked about in their books, that they had access to these things because of these communist communities in the United States. So at first, and at talking to some other trans people in the SCA, I didn't know. I thought it was just they made Joan of Arc a hero, and I couldn't find that primary source. Then I got into this article by Gabrielle Biswalski that actually makes it feel a little bit more secondary than primary or tertiary from Leslie. But that's been the problem. Like how I was talking, like I believed Leslie, but I've been told by other trans people that we haven't found the fact that they were burned because they were presenting as male, because there's too much talk about they were burned because of witchcraft or because they bewitched the people, and that's why they did so well in the army and the military. Like this, take for instance the case of Joan of Arc, made famous for taking on men's clothing and doing battle with the English during the 100 Years' War. Joan was eventually captured by the English, and then because they thought she would be worth money, and then eventually just given up into the French court, because they didn't even try to buy her back. They literally was like, no, you can keep Joan. We're done. We won the wars we needed, just keep. So they just gave her back to the French court. For being a warrior and the leader of the French forces, this is not why Joan was killed. The trial interrogation of Joan of Arc focuses less on Joan's military exploits against the English government and more on Joan's gender. It is heresy, claimed the English, for women to wear men's clothing. They accused Joan of being a witch or heretic because of Joan's masculine presentation. Seemed to defy their biased and understanding of scripture. In the end, after many exchanges back and forth, and after refusing to eschew men's clothing once and for all, or to condemn the wearing of men's clothing, Joan was burned to death. And this is from this is, I would say, is more secondary than Leslie. But I've got Mark Twain's Joan of Arc book that I want to read. And I'm still trying to find the primary source to make it a fact, because I'm still hearing that we don't know for sure.
So can you help me understand what's the difference between a woman donning men's clothing so that she can need to fight as a man, because that's what she had to do, versus someone who is actually like transgendered and believes themselves to be a gender? Like in my understanding of Joan of Arc, we have this person who is presenting in a way specifically so she can get around mundane laws.
Correct.
So,
but that's where I'm getting at.
I'm not sure what the difference really is.
Then that's the problem with the research. Is
Okay.
We don't know how they identified, because we're getting a secondary source from somebody else, because they were illiterate. We don't have their thoughts and processes. We just have their trial and tribulations that they went through with warrior. Female Husbands is the book that I'm most interested in now, that has been talking more about that. Why did they have to present male? Is it because of economy, because they felt they were male, or because other reasons? And that's why in this book it first started, were they actually just lesbians, or was it a trans man with a female? That is
but
problems
a lot of
with the
that
research.
also sounds like extrapolated theory.
Mm-hmm. So
Okay.
it's a lot of, and that's when I was happy I found the peer-reviewed journals, Trans Study Quarterly, so I can actually get more peer-reviewed research. It's got medieval stuff, it's got modern stuff. It talks about transsexuals and transvestites back in that time. They've got about 20 journals now, since they've been doing it for the last couple of decades. So I'm going to subscribe to that to get actually more actual peer-reviewed journals for my research, and not just, we think they're trans because of how they presented, or what they did, or what the trial stated. So that is the problem I'm running into with a lot of my research with the other books I'm reading. So yes, it is a concern that I can't find like absolutes. I'm just finding like maybes. This is how I read it. This is how I interpreted it. So that is part of the research. I am trying to find the primary sources and the absolutes, so I can actually define these people as trans over just male presenting lesbian, or they just wanted to wear the clothing because they thought it was cool or something type of thing. But it's hard when those people's accounts weren't written. So
Thank you.
Shoshone has a hand up.
I've had a hand up for a while. I just didn't think they took it down.
Sorry, I meant to lower it. My bad.
So I'm actually glad I left it open for 20 minutes of discussion. That appreciates a lot of the things that I've been talking to myself about my research. So I do like the questions you had, Brigitte. But yes, that is the hard part about the research. It's a lot of speculation based off of how they're reading the stuff they have. So 4 more minutes. I think I can close this up unless anyone else has any other questions, so we can start scattering to all the rooms. But thank you for coming. I do appreciate the questions. I appreciate the commentary from Shoshana and Telenor about other things to understand with our community. And hopefully next class I'll have even more research and maybe I can answer stuff better.
I wanted to especially thank you, Rosa, for volunteering to do this. Getting people to volunteer is never easy, so thank you for taking that step. I wanted to thank everybody for coming, and a reminder that this has been recorded. It will end up, after it's been processed, on the West Kingdom YouTube channel under a playlist for the DEI Roundtable event. So thank you, everybody, and I'm going to close the recording right now.